Stop the world!
We don't know how things are going to play out again. He's very volatile. If the markets do very well for the next week, it may be that he then decides to put on some more tariffs again. There is no rhyme or reason to this. I don't think this is something that they planned out on the day one of the administration and they're now following through. I think it's very much fly by the seat of your pants and kind of make it up as you go along.
Welcome to Stop the World, the ASPI podcast. I'm Olivia Nelson.
And I'm David Rowe.
Everyone's trying to figure out what Donald Trump is up to with his tariffs on China. Is it a carefully orchestrated plan, as his Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent insists, or is the US president just deciding day by day? Nobody knows, but to help us sift through the possibilities, we have the right person at the right time.
We do indeed. Demetri Sevastopulo is in the thick of it over in Washington as the Financial Times US-China correspondent. Now, Liv, the FT is my favourite paper on the planet. It's bristling with excellent newsbreaking reporters, superb columnists and great feature writers, and Demetri is a case in point. In fact, when we spoke not long ago, Demetri had just published an exclusive about Xi Jinping's purging of the PLA's number 2 general, Weidong, and he tells us all about that.
Demetri gives us his insights into the Trump tariff saga, the escalating trade war, the possibility of a grand bargain, including a trade deal between Washington and Beijing, and the implications for partners and allies, including Australia. He also covers off on major points of tension, including the TikTok ban and China's saber-rattling towards Taiwan.
He really is the perfect brain to pick towards the end of one of the most brain-bending weeks in a while. But let's face it, every week is brain-bending at the moment, which is why we just try to stop the world, or at least slow it down a little bit each week here on the ASPI podcast. All right, let's get into it.
This is David Rowe. I'm here with Demetri Sevastopulo. Demetri, thanks for coming on the program.
A pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
So let's start with the trade war, as I think we can now call it. When the administration came in, the second Trump administration, we were looking at roughly two main possibilities in terms of which way they were going to go. One was that Trump follows the hawks in his administration and looks to pressure and constrain and perhaps decouple from China. The second was that he seeks some kind of grand bargain, possibly involving a trade deal, which might start with pressure through tariffs. So it looks like a decoupling, but then it ultimately leads to some sort of agreement. Is it safe to say at this stage that we are seeing one or the other of those two options taking shape?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer because if I go back to the start of the administration, what was very surprising in the very beginning was that his first moves were not about China. They were about taking over Greenland, annexing Canada, making it the 51st state, obviously Ukraine. And we really didn't hear a lot of talk about China until he unveiled his tariffs, the fentanyl tariffs, as they call them, on Canada, Mexico, and China. But China was at 10% initially, and so it felt to everyone like Trump was going to come in and be very tough on China. That's what a lot of people expected. But actually, he was not being so hard on them. And for the first 2 months, it felt like China was taking a back seat, that he wasn't really thinking about it as much as the other issues, putting pressure on NATO and other countries to boost their defense spending. And then all of a sudden, we have the reciprocal tariffs on Liberation Day on April 2nd, and he slapped tariffs on, more than 100 countries across the world. Big tariff on China. China hits back, US hits back again, and we get into this tit-for-tat. And all of a sudden, we've got this huge tariff on China, but we also have big tariffs, not quite as much, but big tariffs on many other countries. And then the bond markets in the US come under pressure, and all of a sudden Trump reverses course on all of the other tariffs and then boosts them on China. So now we're left with a situation that I think some people would have expected 3 months ago, which is big tariffs on China and not so much on the allies. But it kind of happened in a very unusual, circuitous route. But that's where we are now, which is right now, it's very hard line. And it's, most people I talk to in Washington and Chinese sources I talk to too, at the moment, there's no light at the end of the tunnel.
So it's so bound up, in other words, with the sort of gamesmanship around the broader tariffs that it's hard to tell whether this is actually a China strategy or whether it's a tariff strategy that, China has just ended up as the last one being targeted.
I think it's the latter, yeah. I mean, I've been talking to people and it was pretty clear that when the administration came in 21st of January or whatever it was, there wasn't a plan then to boost tariffs on China to over 100%. That was not on the cards. Maybe Peter Navarro, the very, very hawkish trade official in the White House, was hoping for that. But most other people in the administration, in the White House, that was not on their bingo card. And so I think some of those people working for Donald Trump are just as surprised at where we are now on China as many other people are.
Fascinating. So let's just talk about the trade war, if that is indeed what we're in now. Talk about the sort of dynamics of that. Who has, I suppose, the escalation dominance? Who has the upper hand? Who stands to win and lose if both sides sort of dig in and it continues to go on the direction that it's going on now?
Well, so I think if you step back and if you ask yourself who of the kind of key players in the administration is most closely aligned to Trump ideologically, and when I say key players, I mean, there's many, but the ones I think who are the most important right now are Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, Jameson Greer, who is the US trade representative, so kind of the lawyer who does all the nuts and bolts of any trade deals, and then Peter Navarro, who is the White House trade official, who is the most hard line. And he's a quirky character. Many people dismiss him. People on Wall Street don't like him because of what he pushes and would love to see him fired. But if you go back 20, 30, 40 years, Donald Trump and Peter Navarro, before they even met each other, were singing from the same hymn sheet, which is other countries around the world are ripping off America, and the US needs to step up and do something about it. So I think Peter Navarro is much more important than conventional wisdom in Washington and beyond sometimes suggests. That doesn't mean he's going to be driving the train all the time. When it comes to how do you alter course or reverse course if the bond markets tank or if the equity markets are tanking as they have been, that's when you call in someone like Scott Bessent, who is a former hedge fund manager who understands how market works. So there will be adjustments where different officials will become more prominent and more powerful at certain points in time. But I think the general direction that Trump is going in is one that Peter Navarro strongly supports. Mm-hmm. And so I think right now we've had a kind of a tactical retreat from Trump when it comes to other countries. But the focus now for the time being is huge tariffs on China. And, there are people in the administration who think that's a smart idea. There are people in the administration who think that that's probably Trump has gone too far. And, the markets on Thursday in Washington in New York, I should say, in the US have also reacted fairly badly. So we're still in really, really rocky waters, I think.
Do you see any evidence that the more traditionalists, the ones that we think of as I suppose the traditional foreign policy minds and who also are the China hawks, notably Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, do you see any significant impact of their presence?
I don't think that they are really a big part of the discussions on trade. I think there may be times when these things overlap, but right now I think there's kind of two buckets. So you have the traditional national security issues where Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz are definitely very hawkish on China and will want to do certain things. But right now, when it comes to the trade and economic and markets bucket, it's really the four characters that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. And I think when Trump talks about discussions he's had with his team on how to deal with the way the markets have reacted to his tariffs, the people he names are not Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz. It's the Commerce Treasury Secretary, Peter Navarro, and the US Trade Representative. So right now, they're kind of the key players.
Yeah, okay. So it's still a bit unclear on the US side. I'm interested in the China side as well. I mean, where does Xi Jinping stand at the moment in terms of what his options are? Is it reasonable to say that, however strong he obviously is in China domestically, that he's not in a position, that he would lose credibility at home if he were to compromise, and that would be a blow to his stature? Is he sort of constrained a little bit as well? Or what do you see him doing?
Well, I think he is probably a little bit constrained politically, but I think the bigger issue here is that even though China has economic problems over the last couple of years and, has areas where it's really struggling, it's still a much stronger country than it was vis-a-vis the US when Trump first came into office in 2017. And I think China feels, and, over time we'll see which view is right and which is wrong. China feels that it's able to tolerate the pain that this is inflicting on the Chinese economy, or will be able to, and it's not going to kind of cave into US pressure. So, Donald Trump is basically saying, and has essentially said publicly, as have Lutnick and Bessent, I want Xi Jinping to kind of call me and I want to do a deal with Xi Jinping. And the Chinese are saying directly to the White House, we are not Canada, we are not Mexico. If you think that you can bully us with your tariffs and we're going to come to the table and offer you something, well, then you don't understand China. So right now, I think we're in a massive game of economic chicken. I think the US side and the Chinese side right now are very dug in. And it's difficult to see at the moment what would kind of unblock that and get the two sides talking. Because at the moment, there are working level discussions between different parts of the US government and different parts of the Chinese government, but there are no serious conversations at senior levels about even a telephone call between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. So, that's really where we are. There's nothing serious happening at the moment. And I don't see any sign right now that either side is going to give in.
Right. What kind of leverage does China actually have on the trade front? I mean, Besant in particular has made out that all of the liability here is on the China side, given that they've got this massive trade surplus. They've got everything to lose, is the way he's putting it. But obviously, they supply things that the US needs. And a couple of things that come to mind are critical minerals, obviously, and perhaps some critical components to things that are made in America, perhaps like pharmaceutical ingredients, something like that. How much leverage does China actually have in this on the trade side?
They have a huge amount of leverage that they can deploy if they decide it's worth taking the risk in deploying it. So I'll give you another example. I mean, yes, critical minerals is one, but the average American, that's too abstract for them and it doesn't affect their daily lives. What if, for instance, the Chinese government said to the different Apple manufacturers, iPhone manufacturers in China, you can no longer export iPhones or iPads to America? That's something that would be felt, in a draconian way very quickly here. Now, it's a very extreme response, but I think given where we are in the trade relationship right now, I think in both sides, you have to actually consider what some of these extreme responses might be. So China could do something like that. Some people have suggested that the level of tariffs is now so high that Chinese exporters won't be able to make any money by exporting. So could you see a situation where Chinese exporters in certain industries where profit margins were already very tight, just decide there's no point exporting to the US because you're going to lose money. And if that's in, products or sectors where they're selling things to Americans that Americans really need, well, that's pain that's going to be felt here. And although Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick say that, China has less tolerance for pain, I'm not sure that's true. And at the end of the day, it's important to remember China does not have elections. And Xi Jinping definitely has other pressures coming in on him. I mean, he has to make sure he keeps his team on side and that they don't start to criticize him. But he doesn't have to worry about his party being reelected in 2 years, whereas Trump is facing pressure from Republicans, particularly in the House of Representatives, where everyone is reelected every 2 years. It has to go up for reelection every 2 years. Republicans in the House are really worried that they're going to be crucified at the end of next year in the midterm elections. Mm-hmm. I think there's different kind of risks on both sides. And right now, it's too early to work out how both sides are kind of assessing how those risks might unfold over time. Because, you have to remember, the starting gun has just been fired and we're waiting to see how things emerge on the track from now.
Well, relevant to this, I have to bring in your latest scoop. Just as we're speaking an hour or two ago, you've revealed in the FT that the number 2 general in the PLA, General Herr Weidong, has been purged. Just talk us through what's happened here and what's the significance. Is this Xi Jinping getting worried about the loyalty of some of his top generals? What's going on?
Well, it's a black box, so it's difficult to know what the real reason is, to be frank. We confirm from multiple sources that he has been purged. He's been removed from the role within the last 2 to 3 weeks. Speculation had mounted because he hadn't appeared at certain events where the number 2, the vice chair of the Central Military Commission, his formal title, and he's also a member of the Politburo, which is also incredibly important. So he hasn't turned up at events that someone in his position would normally turn up at. So there was a lot of speculation. It's clear now that he's been purged. We don't know if it's part of the anti-corruption campaign that Xi Jinping has been running against the Chinese military, and he's taken down a lot of senior generals, 2 former defense ministers in the last couple of years. So it could be that. It's also possible that there's some kind of a infighting at the top of the PLA and that Xi Jinping was worried about what was happening. It's possible that he thought He Weidong was not loyal to him. So, I mean, there's multiple possibilities and permutations, but it really is a black box. And until we kind of see, if He Weidong emerges and they officially now say that he has been purged, which sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, I think we'll get a sense from their official response as to what's actually happened, whether it's corruption related or whether it's potentially something else. But it's a huge deal.
Yeah, absolutely. How often in your experience, or I mean, insofar as you're able to guess, given the opaque nature of the CCP and the Politburo, how often is it a legitimate case of corruption, and how often is that an excuse for something else?
It's difficult to say because, it's not like Australia or the US where there'll be a court of law or a military trial and the evidence will come out and you can make your own judgment. We're not going to see the evidence one way or the other. So honestly, it's very difficult to say, but there is so much corruption endemic in the Chinese military for one main reason that the system is, people like to say, is it a feature or a bug? In the Chinese military system, in the PLA, corruption is a feature because historically, to get promoted, you have to pay someone to be your kind of supporter and your backer. And everyone, or almost everyone, is doing it. So there's corruption is rife throughout the organization, including at the top. So it's possible sometimes that someone could be taken down ostensibly for corruption and you could provide evidence showing what they had done. But actually, the real reason was that it was some kind of a political move and the corruption was just an excuse, a kind of a trigger to allow Xi Jinping to argue to his peers on or the other people on the Politburo Standing Committee, here's why we need to take down the vice chair of the Central Military Commission. In his mind, he might be thinking, I don't think He Weidong is loyal, but he might say to his members of the Politburo Standing Committee, actually, it's because he was, skimming money off the top or stuff like that. Okay. But it's with most of these cases, frankly, we never find out.
Yeah. Back on China and trade, obviously there's a perfectly reasonable case that China has been exploiting the international trade system for some decades now, certainly since it joined the WTO in 2001, and that what Trump is doing, I mean, some are arguing what Trump is doing is that is a necessary corrective to tame that abuse. What's your view on that? I mean, how effective is this as a tool as opposed to, say, investing the effort into a more rules-based approach that, we've traditionally, that we've grown up with over the recent decades, investing in reforming the WTO, for instance, and trying to hold China to account that way. What do you think about that?
I think in the US, what's happened both in successive administrations and on Capitol Hill is that what started out 20 years ago as a level of optimism that China could be brought properly into the international rules-based order, the WTO would work, that China would become more like the West than the reverse. I think whatever level of optimism there was originally has essentially dissipated, and people have come to the conclusion that China is going to keep doing the things it was doing, and that really you have to change the nature of the system dramatically and punish China in different ways to make it change, because it's not going to do it on its own accord. And I think most people in Washington, with a few exceptions now, buy into that view. And so that leads you then, how do you force China to change? And really, you come up with these, I mean, some people would say draconian, but Trump's view is there needs to be a draconian restructuring of the global economy. And in the short term, there's going to be pain. And until yesterday, when the markets crashed, he was essentially saying, listen, just suck up the pain. In the long term, it's going to be better for America. Jobs will come back. Factories will come back. Americans will get richer. But to be able to replicate in the US things like supply chain clusters to manufacture whatever it is, an iPhone or an iPad, it's incredibly difficult to replicate those and takes an awful long time. So this is, it's a game-changing shift. It's a massive gamble that Donald Trump is taking. And I think, along the way, as markets react at different points in time, we're going to see whether the US actually, whether Donald Trump has the tolerance
Yeah.
for pain that he's going to need to push through what he says he wants to do. I think it's massively complex, and on the American side, you often hear quite simplistic things about how China will have to do this or have to do that, and I don't think it's going to be that easy. And I don't think most people who study these things for a living think it'll be easy either.
Yeah. So obviously Trump supporters are claiming that he's playing a brilliant strategy and it's, 4-dimensional chess or 9-dimensional chess, however many dimensions you choose. I don't know how much evidence there is for that. Apart from anything else, true geniuses tend not to wind up hosting reality TV shows. But what's the most generous interpretation of what Trump is doing with the tariffs? Can you see if you were to accept at face value this idea that he's running this brilliant strategy, how can you actually see that playing out?
Well, I think right now it's hard to say that it's a brilliant strategy. And I'll give you an example. So when he reversed course on Wednesday, April 9th, his team came out and said, the media doesn't understand what's happened here. This is Donald Trump, the author of The Art of the Deal. He's basically doing the art of the deal, and you don't realize that. You haven't seen that. And what he's done is he's convinced, by taking these scorched earth tactics, 75 plus countries have come begging to Donald Trump saying, let's do a deal, let's do a deal. And therefore it's working. But then that was his press secretary. But then a few hours later, he came out and he said that he changed course. He started thinking about changing course a couple of days before the markets crashed because he saw the markets were getting a little bit jittery. And he saw, financial CEOs on television like JP Morgan's CEO, Jamie Dimon, saying there might be a recession. This could be really bad. And that on Wednesday morning, he decided to reverse course. And it all happened over the course of a day or two, which just undermined the spin coming from the White House that this was a plan all along. It clearly wasn't the plan. And I think, if you wanted to, the most generous interpretation is that if Trump had done some of these things in a narrower way or in a less aggressive way initially, maybe the markets wouldn't have reacted so badly so quickly and he could have continued course. But because he basically launched an economic nuclear war against the whole world, I think he shot himself in the foot. And I think, again, yesterday, Wednesday, was the day that he realized he was shooting himself in the foot and decided to, for now, to pause most of the reciprocal tariffs. We don't know how things are going to play out again. He's very volatile. If the markets do very well for the next week, it may be that he then decides to put on some more tariffs again. There is no rhyme or reason to this. I don't think this is something that they planned out on the day one of the administration and they're now following through. I think it's very much fly by the seat of your pants and kind of make it up as you go along.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Those 75 countries that have come to the US asking for deals, I'm very interested in how that might actually play out and what it means more broadly for partners, particularly in Asia. Australia, obviously, we're in the middle of an election campaign. It might have gone unnoticed in the rest of the world given everything else that's happening, but here we are. And yesterday, the Chinese ambassador in Canberra, Xiao Qian, told the Sydney Morning Herald that China and Australia should jointly defend the trade system and maintain their, quote, open and cooperative trade relationship in the face of the US tariffs. Said China stands ready to join hands with Australia, et cetera, to jointly respond. So clearly the Chinese are already seeing the possibility of, well, certainly an opportunity for them in warming things with trade partners. Australia obviously is very dependent on China for its export. It's a vital source of our GDP. So China is seeing this opportunity, but there's also, it seems, a possibility that China is already worried that as part of the negotiations on tariffs with the US might ask partners like Australia to change their trade relationship with China. It's been speculated about. I think there is probably some basis to it. Do you think that is a possibility? Do you think that the US might actually look to pressure partners to change their relationships with China as part of the negotiations?
I'm not sure. It's possible that some people in the Trump administration will push that. Whether Donald Trump himself will is, I think, difficult to say right now. I think the complication for China is that until Trump reversed course, Trump was basically going against the whole world, which was in some ways, if China was going to be slapped with big tariffs, having everyone else hit with big tariffs was probably a good thing as well, because China could then go to Australia, Japan, South Korea and say, hey, we need to band together. And while those countries, I don't think are going to band together with China, they will have to think more about diversification of their exports and do things quietly without necessarily announcing it, and maybe working more with China. But now that Trump has reversed course and, we've got 100 and whatever it is now, I think 125% tariff on China, which is way higher than any of these other countries. China's kind of out on its own again, which makes it more difficult, I think, for it to kind of go to other countries and say, let's band together. I think it's very complicated. I think really this is going to boil down to a big bilateral, some point, negotiation between the US and China, and other countries will be kind of on the sidelines. But the other thing I just wanted to mention is, let's say it's accurate that 75 countries have come and asked to do deals, and whether that's the real number or not, I don't know. But the US government, even when it's fully staffed with people who have done trade their whole career, does not have the capacity to do trade deals with 75 countries. And so how Trump is going to structure that, whether they're going to do deals or try and do deals with big countries first, like Japan and South Korea and countries like Vietnam, at what point will they actually engage with China? And will they have the capacity to do it? We don't know. I mean, that's the the difficult part of when you take on so many countries is, can you actually handle the work? And I think right now the answer is no.
Yeah, it's a very good point, actually. I mean, we've all been around for the negotiation of certainly of comprehensive free trade agreements, and they take years.
They take years, exactly.
And hundreds of people work on them. So I think that's a really, really good point. I'm conscious of the time, and I've focused a lot on the tariffs because it's just been such a fantastic opportunity given, what's big this week and this month to talk to you about it. But I just do want to tick off on a couple of other things. One is on TikTok. Obviously, after a 90-day pause after Trump came in, he's now extended that by a further 75 days. You've done some reporting on this. There's talk about various consortia of Americans purchasing a majority of TikTok from ByteDance, Andreessen Horowitz, Blackstone, etc. But it remains very, very unclear what's going to happen with actually the key security issue, which is the famous algorithm and the potential or the likely ability for the Chinese government to exercise control over that algorithm, which of course shapes what TikTok uses. And there's 170 million of them, of course, in the United States, what they see and whether they see narratives that are favorable to Beijing's strategic interests and so forth. Have you seen anything in the course of your reporting that suggests that the resolution to this will actually satisfy that big question of the algorithm and who controls it?
No, and I think there's a lot of confusion about this at the moment. So, last week when the latest deadline for ByteDance, the Chinese owner of TikTok, to divest the app came around, the White House had signaled that they were going to announce a big deal the day before the deadline. But when the day before came, they came out and Trump said, I'm going to extend the deadline again. And people involved in the various negotiations on the commercial side, the tech companies, and the White House also suggested that there was a deal had been done, and then at the last minute, the Chinese said, we're not going to agree to this because of the tariffs. So the Chinese were linking the two. Now, the problem with that argument is there's no evidence. I'm not saying it's wrong, but there's no evidence that China was actually willing to allow an American company to control the algorithm, or even to allow ByteDance to sell TikTok. Now, ByteDance seems to have told some of these other potential investors they think China's on board. But we don't know if that's true or not. And there's been nothing out of China officially suggesting that they are willing to do this. So to me, there's two questions. Is Trump negotiating a deal that would ensure the algorithm is controlled by an American company? And at the moment, I think the answer to that is not necessarily. And then the second question is, if the deal he does reach eventually doesn't give an American company control of the algorithm, is Congress going to accept that? And there are pretty loud voices in Congress, including Republicans like Senator Tom Cotton, who's the head of the Intelligence Committee or the chair of the Intelligence Committee, who are adamant that the algorithm cannot remain in Chinese hands, in Chinese control, and that if it is, the companies that are trying to buy TikTok could potentially be in breach of US law. And some of these companies are trying to get Congress to indemnify them and basically say, if you do all these things, you're not going to be in breach of American law and you'll be fine. And these lawmakers are pushing back saying, we're not going to do that. So you're in risk of, financially having huge fines if you go ahead with this. So I think we're, I'm from Ireland, and the expression "it's a long way from here to Tipperary." I think it's still a long way to Tipperary. And I wouldn't rule out that Trump then extends the deadline again when we hit the next deadline. So I think it's also very murky. It's not clear to me there really are any discussions between the Chinese government and the US government on TikTok. There may be, but I haven't seen any proof that there is.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And apart from being jealous of Irish people that they can throw out references to Tipperary, it occurs to me that why would the Chinese government part with the algorithm that they are clearly very attached to and part with control of TikTok, which is such a strategic asset for them? I mean, apart from anything else, their attachment to it clearly demonstrates that, in fact, it's perfectly correct that they are able to use it to shape users' understanding of the world. But it's very unclear to me why the Chinese government would actually agree to this deal that is being floated by the US government.
It's also a mystery to me. China has to receive something to agree to do something, like, even if they were willing to do it. So potentially down the road, if there is some kind of a big, grand bargain negotiation between Trump and Xi Jinping, potentially TikTok could be one of the elements of that. But right now, there are no big negotiations. And so I don't see why China would agree to do it.
Yeah. All right. Now, I can't let you go without talking briefly about Taiwan. You reported recently Joseph Wu, the Taiwanese National Security Advisor, was in Washington recently for the so-called Special Channel meeting. Chinese, at the same time, are conducting exercises which are widely seen as rehearsals for an invasion or blockade. And the Indo-PACOM commander, as you recently reported, described them as essentially disguised rehearsals. What is your sense of China's, of Xi Jinping's calculations right now with respect to Taiwan? I mean, do you think that anything about his timetable for a forced integration or any of his calculations have demonstrably shifted since Trump took over? And how do you assess US resolve at this point to support Taiwan and to defend it if necessary?
My sense is that at the moment, there hasn't been a material change since Trump took over. And that's because until Xi Jinping and Donald Trump start talking about some kind of a deal, and if Donald Trump starts talking about, he would be willing to give less support to Taiwan in exchange for Xi Jinping doing something on trade or economic reform, at that point, the Chinese would have a sense of where Donald Trump is going on Taiwan. I think right now they don't really know where Trump is going to go on Taiwan. Right now, they also have to focus on this trade war. They have their own economic, headwinds. I don't think it's a good time for Xi Jinping to kind of wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, as your former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd often says. The trick is that Xi Jinping wakes up in the morning, looks in the mirror as he's shaving and says, today is not a good day to invade Taiwan. And I think that is the case at the moment. In a year's time, if Trump has signaled that he's not that supportive of Taiwan, it's possible that the Chinese may take a different calculation. But I don't think people should be worrying about anything imminent happening. But it's clear that the trend is, as you said, that China is doing so many huge exercises, and each one is more comprehensive than the previous one, that we've got to a point where it's difficult, or will be difficult, to know, is a Chinese military exercise just an exercise, or is it actually the preparations for the real thing? And it's hard, 10 years ago, you would easily be able to answer that question. It's harder to answer that question today.
Do you think that Taiwan is likely to be on the table in Trump's mind in some kind of wider agreement?
Well, Trump in the past, including when he went to Beijing in, I think it was 2018, I was on the trip, so I should remember, he offered to Xi Jinping to mediate between Taipei and Beijing. I think anyone offering to mediate between the two would suggest that sounds like he'd be willing to help China more than Taiwan, because I don't think Taipei wants anyone mediating.
Well, it reminds me of the Russia-Ukraine mediation, of course, which is the way that Trump has portrayed it. I mean, famously in the Oval Office meeting with Zelensky, he portrayed the US as almost a sort of independent, neutral arbiter between an aggressive authoritarian giant and its victim democracy neighbour. So, yeah, that is an interesting parallel. All right. Look, Demetri, you've been very generous with your time. I'm conscious of just how flat out you are this week, and we're extremely fortunate to have grabbed you for half an hour or so in what is one of the busier weeks, no doubt, in your journalistic career, your long and illustrious journalistic career. So, look, thanks for joining us on Stop the World, and hopefully we can have you back again sometime soon.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. And happy to be back anytime.
Thanks for listening to Stop the World. That's all we have time for, folks. We'll be back with another episode next week. Bye for now.